that time of year, huh? You decide what type. It's definitely that time of year. What that is, it's up to you. So I'd like to start talking this morning a little bit about the Lotus Sutra. And I titled this talk, or this series of talks, Looking to the Lotus. And the reason for this is my intention to start teaching from the Lotus Sutra in 2025, which I haven't been doing very much of, and other teachers haven't been doing very much of here for quite a few years. Lotus Sutra has been very important in the development of Budai Temple, and then haven't been studying it directly for maybe the past 7 or 8 years. I think the last time we did a series on the Lotus Sutra was in 2016, and it was the fall of 2016. We had a study period, I don't know, it was 10 or 12 weeks, trying to race through the Lotus Sutra in preparation for another kind of study that we're planning at that time that got postponed. So that's the reason that taking up the Lotus Sutra. I mean, that's kind of the provisional reason. The deeper reason is because it's the Lotus Sutra, and it is quite remarkable. The Lotus Sutra, in terms of where are we receiving it from, which is slightly different than asking the question, what's its history? You could look at it just in a very historiological way and try to understand the forces that birthed the Lotus Sutra from a kind of human perspective, historical human perspective, and that has some merit, but I'm largely uninterested in that. I'm much more interested in what is the emergence of wisdom in the world that's not just definable in some kind of like historical explanation or context. And so we can say that our first, the first followers of the Buddha that were working with something that was the Lotus Sutra or looked like the Lotus Sutra would have been, probably 600 or 700 years after Shakyamuni Buddha lived in South Asia. And from antiquity, there emerged this teaching of the Lotus Sutra. We don't really know what the oldest versions of it were. Oftentimes people assume it was in Sanskrit because so much Buddhist teaching was in Sanskrit, and when it made its way to China, was translated then into Chinese. And really throughout East Asia, Chinese was the standard language for all Buddhist teaching. So even though as it traveled to Japan, in Japan still people read the Lotus Sutra in Chinese. Same thing in Vietnam, same thing in Korea. So East Asian Buddhism, really the Chinese version of the text would have become dominant. But some people think that was not in Sanskrit. Sanskrit was a very highly philosophical language for very educated people, and so that's why a lot of the sutras made their way into Sanskrit at some point, because the philosophical class, the religious class that was taking care of that, would have used Sanskrit as their common language, very, very technical language. So many people think actually it was probably in a local dialect of somewhere, were those original ones. What got translated from into the Chinese, we don't really know. From a historical perspective, from a religious perspective, we say the truth got translated, and don't worry about it too much. So those early translations into Chinese, there are really 3 translations, but 2 really dominant translations. The first was by a monk named Dharma Raksha, and that was the first translation that was in, looking at my notes here, 286, so very early on. And then the translation that became the standard translation of the Lotus Sutra was done by a great translator named Kumarajiva, who was responsible for massive amounts of translation from texts from South Asia into Chinese, East Asian language. And his translation was done in 406. I say his translation, that really they translated as a team. So if you're reading about this from a scholarly perspective, they'll say Kumarajiva's team translated in 406, which is really where you get the best translations. One of my students and members of Budai, who hasn't lived in Eugene for a very long time, many of you know Jun Mei, she's a Buddhist scholar, And she was telling me about this scene. I didn't realize this. She said the Kumarajiva scene was like a stadium. People would come to watch him translate, and there would be this big crowd of people, and they would have the team in the middle, scholars who were good at reading the original text, whether those were in Sanskrit or Pali or other local languages, Kumarajiva, who had faculty in all of them, and then these scribes, and so they would read passages, and then Kumarajiva would kind of channel them into Chinese, and they would get recorded in Chinese. And I'm sure there was some editing process that happened after that, etc. But quite a dynamic process. So that text of Kumarajiva, with some slight shifts from really 400 down till today. So for the past 1600 years, the text that we'd be studying, that's the Lotus Sutra. It's been translated into English and in many different ways. There's many different translations of the Kumarajiva text. There's not any Dharma Raksha translation yet, although Junmei told me she's working on one, so we'll see. I'll just let you know a couple of the ones that I'll be using while I'm teaching, and I think as other people are doing things with it, probably these will be the texts that are the most central. Many of you have seen this version of the Lotus Sutra, which is by a scholar named Jean Reeves. And really love this translation. This was the translation. The one you cut your teeth on is the one you're going to like the best, probably. And so for me, when I was really getting closer to the Lotus Sutra and studying it more, this was the translation that I was working with. It was relatively new at that time. But I'm quite fond of this. Because there's so much imagery, which we'll get into this morning a little bit, in the Lotus Sutra, it's a very visionary text, very visionary teaching, that it really makes a difference how a person is working with the language in that regard. When you read it, what does it open up in you in terms of your capacity, your visionary capacity? And so I quite like this one. So this is the only one I really used. I would reference other ones in the Chinese for study purposes, but this was the one that was closest to my heart. And then recently I obtained a copy of another one that was done more recently. I think this came out in 2019, the Threefold Lotus Sutra, a modern translation for contemporary readers, which I was very suspicious of when I read the title. Contemporaries, like we're always trying to make things, like match us, than us sort of like, getting off it and like learning how to do the other thing, right? So I'm a little suspicious of that. But as it turns out, I quite like it. What they did is they tried to normalize, what they meant by contemporary readers was some of the older translations had a lot of biblical type language. There was a lot of thou shout type of stuff, which was just the kind of religious vernacular that people were used to when they were translating stuff in the 50s or whatever. And so it's just a little jarring when you read those translations. Jean Reeves' translation isn't like that. But so that was one thing they meant by contemporary. But the thing I really like that they did in this is they put a lot of the Buddhist words back in just as Buddhist words. In the earlier translations, people didn't have any relationship with the word Dharma, for example. And so they're always translating the word Dharma as law, which is one of the ways you can understand it. But while you're reading the text and you keep coming back to law, it sort of feels like a commandment, or like what's the covenant with God and what law did God require of us in the covenant, etc. I'm starting to get it would hold a lot of those kind of Abrahamic qualities to the words. So this one, they put a lot of those words back in, and then they have a pretty extensive glossary in the back, so you can look things up and navigate it this way. Anyway, part of my talk this morning really is kind of a commercial for the Lotus Sutra, and an encouragement to people. This isn't a sutra like the Diamond Sutra, for example, which we've studied a lot, which is within the Prajnaparamita text family. You can read that in a half hour, 40 minutes, and read it again and again and again and again and again, but you kind of, okay, that's the whole sutra. This is not like that. Even if it were shorter, it wouldn't be like that. Okay, it's not only about the length, but also the kind of teaching it is that you have to develop a relationship with it. So, kind of encouraging people that this is going to be coming up a lot, and you don't need to read it. You'll still be able to follow the teachings that are given, etc. But if you're interested, now's a good time to start reading it and start developing some kind of a relationship. That's a thing that I emphasize a lot. Is that texts are not just something that we read to get something out of and then move on. particularly sutras, we develop relationships with them. And you'll have deeper relationships with some than with others. You won't have any relationship with some. You'll be like the, for example, the Avatamsaka Sutra, which I really love, but I can't quite say I have a relationship with it. I've read parts of it, and I've read some of the scholarship that came out of the teachings of that from the Huayan school that I really appreciate, but I haven't cultivated a relationship. Like, I don't go, oh, let me go back to the Avatamsaka Sutra and read that part. With the Lotus Sutra, I do that all the time. I'm like, oh, I didn't, that part that always was, that was a little weird to me. I never got it, and something just will sink in, you know, and then you go back and you look at it and something else comes alive. So that kind of relationship with a text. You can't have it with all the Buddhist texts, there's too many, but a lot of people have it with the Lotus Sutra. So out of the Lotus Sutra entering into China, really within 100 years or so of the Kumarajiva's translation of the Lotus Sutra, there was the establishment of the Tiantai school, which is a school that used the Lotus Sutra as its foundational text. And there's one scholar I was reading recently that he makes this case, and it seems true to me. I mean, scholars say things, you're like, okay. But it seems true to me, and it's a kind of thing that I think also has importance, not just for scholarly work, but practitioners' work, is he's making the point that this was probably the first time that a wholesale interpretation of South Asian Buddhism into Chinese culture happened. So as the Buddhist teachings change, as they move, they have a kind of outward change in their appearance and how it is that they're connecting with the people that they're teaching. We're all in that project right now, okay, pretty significantly in the West as Buddhism comes here. But the same thing happened when Buddhism came from South Asia into China. And so the establishment of the Tiantai school was in the scholar's perspective, was the first time where there was a totally Chinese Buddhism, right? Up until that point, there was always this kind of back and forthedness about it a bit. And this was the point where like a full expression of a Chinese understanding of the Dharma came forward. And the reason I'm saying that is because what happened then is this became, I would say, really the foundational understanding. The Lotus Sutra created the foundational understanding of Buddhism really for all of East Asia. Many texts were super influential, but the Lotus Sutra really became, in a way you could say, the worldview of East Asian Buddhism, East Asian Mahayana Buddhism. Tiantai Buddhism came to Japan a few hundred years after that in the 800s with a monk named Saicho, and in Japanese is called Tendai Buddhism. We have a little bit of Tendai Buddhism in North America. When I was driving in the Northeast to visit a temple up in Massachusetts this past summer, I was driving down. I like to take the back roads, and I'm on this back road, and I drive by this place, and I kind of see the sign, and then I'm driving. You know how like sometimes it doesn't get in there until you're a little bit past, and I like put on the brakes, and it was like Tendai Training Center of the Western School of Tendai Buddhism or something like that. So I backed up, when nobody was there at that particular time. And then I went back on my way back, and I wasn't able to call to try to get a hold of anybody for a few different reasons. I wasn't able to call, but anyway, I wasn't able to meet anyone. And then a month later, I was at a teacher's conference up at Great Vow Zen Monastery, and 2 Tendai monks were there, and I said, "Oh yeah, I went by this." And they're like, "That's our place." And so there's a little bit, but it hasn't become the most widespread. Zen and some other schools that are based on the Lotus Sutra, like the people might have heard of Soka Gakkai International. Primarily they chant homage to the Lotus Sutra, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. That's their core practice. It's become the largest. But regardless, Saicho established Tendai Buddhism in Japan in the 800s. So that was what's called the Heian period of Japan, and that was where a lot of cultural things were established in what we think about as Japanese culture, and Tendai Buddhism became really the most powerful school. There was another school called the Shingon school that they were kind of rivals. That's another esoteric school that became very dominant. But the Tendai really became the main thing. Mount Hiei, which is the central mountain. Usually a school will have a central mountain. The central mountain for the Tendai school is right outside of Kyoto, which was the capital of Japan at that time and for a long time until the Kamakura period when it moved to Kamakura. But the reason that that's all important is that the dominance of the Tendai school in Japan from like the 800s to say the 1200s, that then made it the Japanese worldview, maybe I would say the Japanese spiritual view, became really the Lotus Sutra. Our hero Dogen, who's the founder of our school, he was living in the 1200s. He was ordained as a Tendai monk, lived on that mountain, Mount Hiei, before he left and started to study Zen. So in this historical line that I'm drawing here from this emergence that we don't really know in a historical sense, other than we know it came from people's deep practice, all the way through to the time of Dogen, there is this teaching of the Lotus Sutra, which is birthing something, and that then continues within our school. Dogen Zenji, founder of this school, in his writing, which he's a prolific writer, the Shobogenzo is his largest work. It's kind of 8 volumes. It's about this big. He quotes the Lotus Sutra by far more than anything else. There are more quotes of the Lotus Sutra than I think all other quotes added up. But Dogen isn't really thought about as being a Lotus Sutra teacher, right? It's just the foundation of the way that he thinks and talks about things. So for that reason alone, for people who want to study in the Soto school, to get a familiarity with the Lotus Sutra is really important. But I would say more than that, the Lotus Sutra really is a kind of text that Zen students need. And what I mean by that is Zen students, particularly in the West, are too darn rational. And that's part of the reason that a lot of people feel attracted to Zen, is because they say, oh, we could eject some of all that complicated sort of flowery religious stuff, and let's do the thing, right? Let's do the meditation, because that's what it's really all about, right? That's kind of what we're saying to ourselves. And so the Lotus Sutra challenges that, and I think that's really important. So how do we deal with a text like this? I've been giving kind of a historical development of how that came to us, or how our school is rooted in the Lotus Sutra. But if we go back to this question about emerging from antiquity, what is a sutra emerging from antiquity mean? How is that the same or different than, say, like a revealed text in Abrahamic faiths, for example? It's an interesting thing to think about. Where does the sutra come from? The sutra itself will start teaching us about where it comes from a spiritual perspective, not a historical perspective. And one of the places that it does this is at the beginning, says, "Thus have I heard." That's how sutras start. Thus have I heard. Sometimes they'll start out as, at one time, the Buddha was at such and such a place. The implication of that is, I heard the Buddha say something, and now I'm telling you about it. But the Lotus Sutra definitely starts with, "Thus have I heard." Mm-hmm. So whatever's written down in the sutra is an account of some teaching that was given. So that's a little different than like a revelation, like there is some kind of powerful God figure of some kind or whatever that people don't really understand what's going on and might just like split open someone's mind at any given period and say like, okay, here's the download, go share it with everybody. And that's a little bit how we might think of a revealed text being. And the sutra here is more like, no, I heard this teaching. But it is a little like the revealed text in the sense that some of the sutras that are heard, or some of the teachings that are heard, are not stuff you could hear with your normal ears or see with your normal eyes. So there's some place in there for kind of overlap between our regard for them in that way. A way we would say it in a Buddhist sense is the thus have I heard from the teachings of the Buddha, so and so and so and so. Who's the Buddha that's being talked about? Is that the Shakyamuni Buddha who is living in South India? Or is that some other kind of Buddha? The conventional answer to that would be that the Buddha that's being talked about there is known as the Sambhogakaya Buddha. The Shakyamuni Buddha is Shakyamuni Buddha's Sambhogakaya form, or the reward form, the reward body of Shakyamuni Buddha. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So the characteristics of this sutra, two that are usually noted by people as they start to read it. The first one is, it never happens. The Lotus Sutra is never taught in the Lotus Sutra. There's a lot of talk about the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, but then you never get to the point where it's like, okay, now this is the Lotus Sutra. And you get the chunk. You're like, okay, this is from page 73 to page 328. That's the Lotus Sutra. You never get that. You get this turning of this flower, of this lotus. And that's very self-referential. It keeps talking about itself. But you never quite get the, well, what is this self that it's talking about? Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like a human life. So it has, so that quality, oftentimes people feel a little frustrated with it. And I'm sorry to inoculate you against that frustration, because that's actually a good frustration in the process of warming up to the sutra. Don't worry, you'll have it anyway. But you'll remember that what I'm saying here. So that kind of quality to it is, on the positive side, you can think of it about, is it's unbound. This isn't the Lotus Sutra. You can't bind the Lotus Sutra. There's no way to contain it in something. And so when you start reading it that way, you'll see that the self-referential language and the continual flowering. Some people have proposed that we could translate it as the Lotus Flowering Sutra, as opposed to the Lotus Flower Sutra. The Lotus Flowering Sutra is that there's always this flowering that's happening. It's continual, a kind of continual turning or a continual flowering, right? It's not containable, and yet it shows up in the stories and the language of this particular thing that has emerged into our world, or we could say bloomed. And of course, the Buddhist teaching is very core for us to recognize that they're ungraspable. The reason they're ungraspable, or maybe I should say the value of them being ungraspable, is actually everything is ungraspable. And so if we're going to learn about the true nature of being, the best kind of teaching we can have is an ungraspable teaching, because the true nature of being is ungraspable. So the ungraspable teaching can teach us about the ungraspability. That can be frustrating for our grasping minds, right? But it's very important. It's a kind of medicine we need. And when you learn to surf those waves, a different kind of thing emerges than the kind of logical way to get to the conclusion. So this is a great invitation in the Lotus Sutra to this different way. Maybe compare it to trudging up the mountain or surfing, this kind of surfing that the Lotus Sutra is asking us to do. My younger Dharma brother, his name is Buddha Ocean, because he's a surfer. And he had these great plans to move to Okinawa and start a temple. But he's not doing it. I'm very frustrated with him, because I want to go to Okinawa and swim. So this is one of the first characters people will notice, the unbound. Then the other one is the fantastic quality to it, the supernatural quality, the massive assemblies of unbelievable quantities of beings, a great jeweled stupa that's even bigger than the earth, rising out of the earth and hanging in the sky. these kinds of images or these kinds of occurrences, the Lotus Sutra is just full of. And that's the thing that I want to just talk a little bit about, a way that you can think about why those types of teachings are important and what they're really pointing to. So when we think about practice in a general sense, we're usually thinking about it in terms of things we can experience. So, we're living my life and just going along. I'm experiencing different things. Sometimes things go well, sometimes things don't go well. But there is a kind of like a sense of how could I do this more completely? How could I do this with more kindness, with more wisdom? In what way could I wake up to the deep significance of a human life and then live according to that significance? That's where our practice is very alive. So usually the way we interpret that, again, is in the experiences or in the things that we can just see in our lives. So if we think like, okay, this challenge for me lately, this isn't a huge challenge, it's kind of a fun challenge, so I have grandkids, which is really great, and my grandson is 3 now, and he is a pill. Mostly in the best possible ways, but he really likes to get what he wants. And so he will kind of throw these fits. And he and I had we had this promise early on when he was younger, which was I don't get mad at him. But it's not working all that well as he's getting a little bit older. And so it's quite different. It's fun. It's fun, this experience, very different than being a parent where you're the one that's going to kind of school them to, form you're the kind of predominant former of their character, their boundaries, values, all those sort of things. As a grandparent, you get to do this cooler thing, which parents can't really do, which is let a lot of stuff go, which allows you to do something else. You have this other kind of role to play, which is cool. But sometimes he pisses me off. He's being a little jerk, And so that would be a kind of situation where you might say, okay, how do I work with this? What kind of patience am I engendering in this different situation? What kind of buttons is he pushing? How do I recognize those? How do I, if I bring that into Zazen and I say, oh, wow, I really feel bad about how I, yelled at him the other night or whatever like that. And he's not used to Grandpa yelling at him, so when I do, it freaks him out quite a bit. And is yelling even the right way to do it? Probably not. The whole thing, right? So you're there working with it and working with the energy of it, working with that. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to purify your eye. That's a way that you could think about it. There's like this way that we are in the world, with the world, the way we see things, the way that we experience things, and it is deeply marked by greed, hate, and delusion. That's a standard Buddhist teaching. Right? And because it's so deeply marked by greed, hate, and delusion, we do stupid stuff. We do stupid stuff because we look at stuff in the wrong way. We look at it through the eye of greed, the eye of hate, the eye of delusion. And so our work there is to try to purify those eyes, or try to figure out how could that eye function differently. Yeah? And we can't do that through a process of fighting the greed, hate, and delusion. When you fight with greed, hate, and delusion, what happens? It gets stronger. It's just the fact of the situation. Right? If you fight with the fighting that you're doing with yourself, it's just more fighting. And so you have to find a different way. You have to find a way to not be in opposition to your own delusion, but to meet the world and allow the world to teach you and realign how it is that you're seeing things. Sometimes we talk about that as mirroring. So, if I'm looking at Ocean Boy and he's taking me off, or he's not taking me off, I got to recognize that when I'm looking this direction is also going this direction. That there's all of this stuff here that's involved in this encounter. Right? And so we spend a long time there studying what's going on, what's happening, in what way is my own karma of greed, hate, and delusion marking this situation, in what way could I just receive it with a different kind of directness. So so I'm just kind of telling a little story here about how we may conceive of practice. But it's a relatively narrow way of conceiving of practice, but I think it's a good one. I think it's like a good description of what we're trying to do all the time. Now notice that everything in there is stuff you can kind of think about, you could talk about, you could see, you could point, this person's involved, this thing's involved, etc. So in a classical sense, we would call this the world of the seen, things that can be seen. It's not only about seeing, but it shows up in your sensory world, through your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Things you can see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think, or feel. Right? It exists in that sensory world. That is referred to as the manifest body or the transformative body of the Buddha when the Buddha appears in that world. Okay? That's called the Nirmanakaya Buddha is the technical term for it. So the transformational body, meaning it's the body of the Buddha that shows up and transforms in the world of things that we can see. Life gets better when we practice that way. We get wiser, we get kinder, hopefully. Yeah. And that's a really important function. It's a really important body of the Buddha. But the Buddha who teaches the Lotus Sutra, like I had brought up earlier, is the Sambhogakaya Buddha, the reward body of the Buddha, or the enjoyment body of the Buddha. We could say that Buddha doesn't just exist in the regular sensory world, that Buddha exists in a kind of super sensory world. It has to be seen with different eyes, not the conventional eyes that can grasp, that can say, oh, I know this is this person, this is this feeling, this is this situation. But the eyes that can see things that don't exist in that kind of graspable sense. There's a third body which is known as the Dharma body of the Buddha, or the law body of the Buddha. That body can't be seen at all. And the reason that body can't be seen at all is because it is 100% intimate to everything. There's no way to have any distance on it through which experiencing can happen. It's like your eyeballs can't see themselves. I mean, you can look in a mirror, but that's cheating. Then you're seeing a reflection of your eyeballs. Can't kiss your own lips. You can smack them, but you can't kiss them. All right? So that's the Dharma body. So this Sambhogakaya body, or this body of fulfillment, or the reward body, this is a body, and sometimes we could say is like a intermediary between this world of complete incapacity to see. It is the law, but it's unknowable, ungraspable, unseeable in any way, and what becomes just very manifest. And it's that intermediary which is visionary. This is true in all, I would say, or at least most spiritual traditions. That this is why the visionary stuff comes about. And it's important for us to not try to squish it into one thing or the other. The Nirmanakaya perspective or way of understanding the teachings conforms much more closely with our rational mind, particularly our rational historical mind. And so you'll hear a lot of Buddhist teachings, they're like, yeah, all that other stuff was made up later because people couldn't get over all the fantastic religious stuff. So they added it all on later. There are some people who have that perspective. They're wrong, by the way. If you want to know what the right answer is, that's not it. But that's the way they would think about it. But in this tradition that comes with the Lotus Sutra, it says, no. There is something which is not coming and going in this world. There is an awakened Buddha, which is not coming and going in this world like the Buddha Shakyamuni, that was the Nirmanakaya in India, in South Asia. But there is some more fundamental awakening that isn't bound in time. It isn't something that just lays out in historical time. That's the Sambhogakaya Buddha. That's what's being, that's where this sutra is being taught. Now, why is that important? Because that world is 100% active in your being and your living. because we can grasp the first kind, we can say like, oh, that's that person, this feels like that feels like that. We think that's what life is. That's like the milk scum on the top of your chai, right? It's just like a little, it is important, but it's not the whole thing. And if you look into your own heart for very long, you'll be like, well, I'm not in control. Right? There's all kinds of forces moving through me that I don't understand, I don't know, and it's not just psychological or emotional, it's throughout the whole world. Why are things moving the way that they are? What's happening? It's not all graspable, it's not all understandable in that kind of sense, that sensory world type of understanding. And so that mirroring that we do with the sensory world things, I'm talking about my grandson Kai and just, like trying to learn from him and trying to cleanse my own view of things through meeting him with sincerity. The same thing is possible in these intermediary realms. It's not only possible, it's really necessary. If you don't do it, then you don't touch those other parts of being. And if you don't touch those other parts of being, you'll be very surprised that you're just practicing your tush off, but you're still a jerk. And you're like, I don't know why. Well, it's like, well, because there's a whole bunch of things there that you're not paying attention to. How do you pay attention to those? The Lotus Sutra is a kind of introduction to that, or an invitation to paying to that. The same way that we would mirror with things of the kind of conventional world, we can mirror in the more fantastical, right? Or the things, I am quite fond of the word imaginal, which has started to come into parlance a little bit more. It was coined by, I believe it was coined by Corban. Didn't Corban coin that word?
Yeah.
I think he did, yeah. Henry Corban is a scholar of Sufi mysticism. Really amazing person if you like to geek out on that stuff, highly recommended. But this term imaginal, meaning it's not imaginary, it's not something that's just a fantasy that someone made up, but that our heart has the capacity to see in a different way, not in the conventional graspable way of things, but it has a way to encounter truths, to encounter beings, to encounter stories with another faculty. The faculty of the heart is image, is the imaginal. This is Corban's way of talking about it. And I think it's just dead on when we talk about something like the Lotus Sutra. So as we encounter the stories, as we encounter these different images from the Lotus Sutra, this practice takes on a little bit different feel. But the first thing you have to do is hear the stories. Right? You have to hear what's being presented there. You have to see that. And that's why I say that why this Lotus Sutra became such an underpinning of East Asian Buddhism is because it provides an access to that world that is the intermediary world. And it gives us some of it as stories in the Lotus Sutra, but like I said, it's not a closed system. It's unbounded. So it's bringing us into something which is alive and constantly flowering, so flowers through our own life of vision, our own life of being able to see in a different way. Okay, so that's my case for that part. And I'll make one last case and then I'll stop, I promise. People know this fancy word hermeneutics.
Mm-hmm.
It's you got to have a few of these, especially if you're talking with professors and stuff like that. I know there's a few of you guys in the room. You just need to drop those words every once in a while. I know what I'm talking about. So hermeneutics is, and now I'm going to probably botch the definition, but basically it's how do you interpret a text, or how do you interpret anything really? But when it comes to religious texts, that's where the tradition really kind of developed in originally was. How do you understand reading the Bible? What is it? How do I understand these things? I'm receiving some teaching, and really, if we're receiving a real spiritual teaching, it's going to be unsettling in some way. And what I mean by that is not necessarily you're going to feel super nervous, although that also can happen, but that it unsettles your view of the world. Isn't that exciting? I mean, I just love that. I know we don't, oftentimes we're not so into that, and sometimes it can be challenging, but unsettling our view of the world is really kind of super important, right? So a real teaching, if we've received it, we might hear a teaching and we haven't received it yet, we argue with it, whatever. But when we really receive the teaching, it will unsettle us in some way. So in that unsettling, how do we then make sense of it? Do we just explain it back into our framework of understanding? That happens probably most of the time, right? You get unsettled and then you kind of make an interpretation that fits with your whatever, which is fine, because it probably planted some seeds in there that will start growing and breaking apart the concrete of your rigid view. But we can also go through this kind of well, we can pay attention. We can say on purpose, I'm going to pay attention to how it is that I'm receiving this teaching and how it is that it starts getting interpreted into my way. And that's a kind of study of how do I receive the teaching. So in that realm, there's a couple things that I'd like to point out as you start to read the Lotus Sutra, if you take that up. First one is there's a lot of ways to read things. And I think that we've narrowed our idea of how to read things quite a bit. Reading things usually means, a cup of coffee underneath the reading light, doing this. If you're kind of a real studious type, maybe taking notes or writing in the margins or something like that. And you're trying to understand what you're reading. Try to understand it. That's a good way to read the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra will mess with you. That's the only way you read the Lotus Sutra, because it doesn't really yield to that kind of extractive way of understanding the meaning. Okay? So we're given tests and stuff. Remember, like grade school, and they make you take the reading comprehension tests. So we're really trained for that kind of reading: comprehend, 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 comprehend. But there's another kind of reading which used to be really popular within education, but sort of fell out of favor: memorization or recitation. Which doesn't matter if you understand the poem or not, just memorize it and say it over and over again. And the kind of modern way of thinking about that is that's super worthless. It has no educational value because you don't really get the meaning. You're just parroting it. That's kind of the story that we've told ourselves. But that's bunk. That's not true. Actually, when you memorize something, now those words become your words in a way, and the world starts looking like something else because you have a different set of words. So then the first way of thinking about it, we think that the meaning is always secondary to the words. This is kind of a fine point we'll come back to again and again. The Lotus Sutra is very strict on this. The meaning does not exist behind the words. The meaning doesn't exist like hidden down inside the words somewhere. The words themselves are the meaning. The story itself is the meaning. There's not this secondary thing you're going to pry out of it in some way. So that kind of comprehensive oriented reading, it's important because you want to see what's going on. If you want to figure out Shakyamuni Buddha was this Buddha in the line of how many thousands and thousands of lamp-light Buddhas through this amount of time, and he was the 8th son of the last Buddha in the thing. You got to do some reading comprehension. Like you could do an ABC multiple choice test on that, right? You're just trying to keep track of what's being said about who's where in the story. So that's there, that kind of comprehension, but the deeper meaning's not going to reveal itself in that way. So recitation of the text, especially once you've read it and you get familiar with it, or read part of it and get familiar with it, just reading it out loud, or just reading it even quietly, but with a real emphasis on not having to understand it, but just receiving it. That kind of reading is something that really goes a long way. Extractive reading versus attentive reading. That's a way you could think about it. So that's one thing to work with. And then the last thing I think I'd say in terms of as people head into it, and then next week I'll start talking about some stories a little bit from the Lotus Sutra, is the Lotus Sutra has a lot of parables. And that's pretty straightforward. A parable is a story that illustrates a teaching or a truth. And it does it in a very, it uses symbolism in a very straightforward way. Like, this is a symbol for that. So, for example, in the Lotus Sutra, one of the really important parables is this parable of the burning house. And so the Buddha is giving this teaching to the assembly and says, it's kind of like this. It's like, I have this I have this house, and it's this massive mansion. It's great, but it's all burning down, and it's filthy, and it's rotting, and it's really not, it's not going to work out. And I have these 3 children, and the children are playing with their toys, and they won't stop playing with their toys. And I keep telling them, hey, the toys are great and everything, but guess what? The house is burning down. We should probably go. And the kids are like, don't hear their dad. They're just playing with the toys. And so at some point, he says, hey, guess what? These little toys you're playing with, there's actually much better toys outside. And they're bigger and they're real. You're playing with a toy cart, but out in front there's a real cart. And there's a cart, there's one cart that's pulled by deer, one by goat, and one by an ox. And if we go out there, you can have those carts. And so the kids are like, sweet. So they go out of the house, and when they get outside the house, there isn't that. There is a white ox cart in which the whole universe basically sits on the back of this cart. And then there's this long, long passages about the unbelievable beauty and richness of this cart. Okay, so this is a very minimized version of the parable. The reason I'm bringing it up is when you read a parable like that, each of those things have a really clear symbolic meaning. Right? So you can say the deer cart represents the path of the Shravakas, or the followers of the Buddha that interpreted the Buddhist path in this very particular way as a path to extinction and becoming an arhat. The goat cart represents the Pratyeka Buddhas, and the ox cart represents the Bodhisattvas, and the white cart represents the Ekayana, which we usually talk about the Mahayana. In Tendai Buddhism, there's the Ekayana, the one vehicle Buddhism. Right? So anyway, you don't have to remember all that. What I'm saying is, with those parables, there really is something behind it. Like there's a meaning behind whatever the symbol is. But that is only one way that symbolism works. The sutra itself is not a parable. There are parables inside of the sutra, but the sutra itself is a visionary teaching. Which means when you read about the Buddha illuminating the Eastern Quarter, he sits in the samadhi of innumerable meanings, and a light is emitted from his forehead, which emits all of the worlds in the Eastern Quarter, which turns out is every place, and from the deepest hell to the highest heaven. If you go into that and you try to understand, well, what is the light? What is it standing for? It won't make any sense, because it doesn't stand for anything. It is a symbol, but it's not a symbol that is just symbolizing something that is graspable. It is a symbol which is symbolizing something that is ungraspable. So you can't just look for the meaning behind it. You have to pay attention to the thing itself. So something like light within Buddhism, for example, you're going to hear it all over the place. And every context is going to appear with a different meaning. And that's frustrating, because you're like, what do they mean by the light? But stick with it. If you stick with it, then you start to develop a faculty with that process of those images appearing, as opposed to just a fixed idea about what light means. Light doesn't mean anything. Light is, or light shines would be even better to say. So in what context, what significance emerges from that? So that's a very challenging, because in these visionary type teachings, you will receive a lot of those sort of things. You're just like, I don't know what's going on here. But again, if you stick with it, hear some teachings on it, read some commentaries on it, etc., what you start to see is it's changing how you're seeing things. So your willingness to stay present with these kind of fantastical stories, they change how you see things. And then a meaning starts to appear to you. I would say in this case, it's the thing itself kind of reveals its face of significance in your path and invites you in. So the flower turns, and I hope I haven't confused you too much this morning. But I really encourage people to pick up a copy of the Lotus Sutra. There'll be a few of the Gene Reeves one in the, we call it our store, the shelf out front where there's books and some incense that you can buy. But also these are very available They're in bookstores, often used bookstores, online, etc. So I encourage you to pick up a copy and poke around with it. And if you start getting frustrated with it, come and talk with me or one of the other teachers, and we will commiserate with you. And in the commiseration, you will probably find some light.